Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our session on character and business. My name is Ed Brooks, and I am the Executive Director of the Oxford Character Project, an interdisciplinary initiative at the University of Oxford focusing on character and leadership development. It is our pleasure to be co-hosting this conference with the Programme for Leadership and Character at Wake Forest University. And it's a particular pleasure to welcome you from this beautifully sunny afternoon here in Oxford for this session with Professor Ty Cohen speaking on character and business. This afternoon, following Professor Cohen's talk, we'll have time for questions from the audience. The chat is disabled, but you can submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom at any point. Also, thanks to Wake Forest Programme in Interpreting and Translation Studies, we're offering live interpretation for today's session in both Chinese and Spanish. So if you'd like to access the interpretation, please click the icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Well, to our speaker. Professor Ty Cohen is Associate Professor of Organizational Behavior and Theory at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business, where she conducts research on honesty, moral behavior, negotiation, and conflict, and in particular on the theme of our conference, moral character in the workplace. Professor Cohen has written more than 50 publications, and her work has featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the BBC News magazine. Her paper, Moral Character in the Workplace, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, received the 2016 Outstanding Publication Award from the International Association for Conflict Management. And Professor Cohen has twice been recognized by the Tepper School as Junior Faculty Chair. In 2020, she was also recognized as a Best 40 Under 40 Professor by Poets and Quants, and she is currently serving as President of the International Association for Conflict Management. Professor Cohen, thank you so much for joining us. I, like our audience, much looking forward to learning from you in this hour ahead. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. What an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen with you. Oh, excuse me. Let's share screen number 3. There we go. Okay. So today I'm going to share my work about having a conscience in business, and in particular, guilt-proneness, job performance, and leadership potential. This is a talk about moral character, which I define as a person's disposition to think, feel, and behave in an ethical manner. Throughout this conference, we've heard about a wide variety of different character traits. So, for example, this morning in the Character and Medicine keynote, we heard from Dr. Plous-Ogun, who discussed wisdom, humility, compassion, and honesty, among other important character traits. In the character and diversity keynote yesterday, Dr. Creary discussed courage, justice, temperance, many other virtues. And on Thursday, the character and public life panelists discussed many of these, and also interpersonal responsibility, trustworthiness, integrity, just to name a few. That list is far from comprehensive. And it's hard to kind of understand about all these different character traits, what might matter. So how might we organize all these different character traits, try to figure out what moral character is, what does it encompass? Several years ago, I devised a 3-part framework to try and make sense of the moral character literature, to provide some organization to all the different virtues that people study and discuss when describing a person's character. I've theorized that there's 3 key components that together comprise a person's moral character. And of all the different virtues, character traits we've heard at this conference, we can think of these in 3 broad buckets. Right? One of these is a person's motivation to do good and avoid doing bad, their moral motivation, and often grounded in a consideration of others. Right? But it's not enough to have good intentions. You have to be able to act on them. And that's where self-regulation, self-control, a person's ability, their capability to do good and avoid doing bad comes into play. I've called their moral ability. And then we also know that some people care about being moral. Morality is central to who they are and how they see themselves, how they want others to see them. You can think of that as moral identity. The most moral people among us have high standing on all 3 of these broad dimensions. The least moral might have low standing on all three of these. And most of us are probably somewhere in the middle, right? And that's why we also know that situations, organizational culture can exert a powerful influence on ethical behavior. It's the person and the situation. Yet, some people act consistently, more ethically than others, in different situations and over time, even in the face of pressure or temptation to do otherwise. Those are people we might call high in moral character. So, what do they look like? How might we describe a person with a high level of moral character? Well, they're considerate of others, they're trustworthy, honest, they care about doing the right thing, they consider the consequences of their choices for themselves and others. What I want to focus on today, a character trait that I think is particularly important, is that they have a strong conscience, a character trait that I call guilt-proneness. When they do something wrong, they feel bad about their behavior, they try and correct for what they did, even if no one knows about it. Hiring people, promoting people with these characteristics, it's critical for creating an ethical workplace and for building an inclusive one in which people feel welcome. So let me turn my attention now to guilt-proneness. Guilt-proneness is a moral character trait that captures the extent to which a person would feel bad about their behavior if they did something wrong, even if no one knows about what had happened. Okay. Highly guilt-prone people feel bad about their mistakes. They feel bad about letting others down, about committing transgressions, especially when those actions negatively impact others. Moreover, they can anticipate such feelings before they behave badly. And that's important because it helps them act more responsibly and ethically. People with high levels of guilt-proneness feel a great sense of interpersonal responsibility, and that sense of interpersonal responsibility is critical for job performance and for leadership. Now, we can't talk about guilt without also talking about shame. When we do something wrong, we might feel bad about our behavior, we might feel bad about ourselves, we might feel guilty, we might feel ashamed. How can we distinguish these? I think the clearest way to think about this is to think about the difference between thinking I did a bad thing versus I'm a bad person. With guilt, the focus is on your behavior. It's a more narrow focus on about what you did. We can think of this as a negative behavior evaluation. I made a mistake. When you focus narrowly on your behavior, that tends to be associated with more apologizing, repair behaviors, trying to fix what you did. When we do something wrong in private, it allows us often to focus more narrowly on our behaviors, as opposed to when our transgressions or mistakes are publicized to others, where we start to see ourselves akin to how other people might view us. We make these negative self-evaluations. I'm a terrible person. It's really hard to change your whole self. And as such, shame can be a pretty debilitating emotion associated with withdrawal, avoidance, blaming others. We can feel guilt, we can feel shame in public or private, but often when our transgressions are publicized, we start to think of ourselves as a whole person, and that is a very painful experience. Right? So although guilt and shame can both motivate ethical behavior, guilt, because of its association, its stronger association with repair action tendencies, apologizing, trying to do better in the future, that makes it a uniquely moral emotion. Right? And people who have a tendency to anticipate that they would feel guilty for doing something wrong, they tend to have higher levels of moral character. So how might we assess this? In research studies, I've done a number of studies over many years now where we've tried to ask people questions to tap into their guilt-proneness. Some years ago, I developed a short 5-item scale where we ask people to imagine themselves in different situations people might experience in their everyday lives, and then to imagine how likely it is that they would react in the way described. And so some of these items, the first, after realizing you have received too much change at a store, you decide to keep it because the sales clerk doesn't notice. What's the likelihood you would feel uncomfortable about keeping the money? Some people might think, oh, it's their fault. They didn't notice. I got away with it. I feel fine about that. They might say extremely unlikely. Other people, maybe like my father, who tells a story about in the 1960s or 70s, he kept too much change. He still feels bad about it today, right? They might say extremely likely. Those are the people that we might think of as high in guilt-proneness. Another item at a coworker's housewarming party, you spill red wine on their new cream-colored carpet. You cover the stain, nobody notices. What's the likelihood you would feel that the way you acted was pathetic? Maybe you think, oh, I'm creative, that's really, I got away with it. That's great. And if you think that, say extremely likely, then you'd be low in guilt-proneness. If you think, oh, I feel the way I acted was pathetic, extremely likely, right? That'd be someone high in guilt-proneness. What's so fascinating to me is that these 5 items, 5 strange items people answer, the likelihood they would respond by feeling bad about what they did, they powerfully predict behavior, future behavior, even many months in the future. And that is what got me so interested in studying this topic, where we can ask people a few simple questions and then predict their behavior, their ethical behavior, many months later. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the findings that I've accumulated over the years, looking at guilt-proneness and its associated with behaviors in the workplace or relevant to the workplace. One area that I do research in is negotiation. I do a lot of teaching in this area as well. When I teach about negotiation ethics, I often talk about moral character and personality, and I've administered this 5-item guilt-proneness scale. Turns out that the MBA students who self-report higher levels of guilt-proneness, they lie less in their negotiation role plays over the course of the term. And they make more positive impressions on their counterparts. At the end of each role play, I asked the students, what kind of overall impression did your counterpart make on you? And then you look over time at all the different interactions they've had over the 7 weeks of the course. Turns out the students who are lower in guilt-proneness, they make more negative impressions on their classmates. Right? And they also lie more in the negotiations where they have the opportunity to do so. Right? Those who are high in guilt-proneness make more positive impressions. What about other behaviors in the workplace? One set of behaviors I've focused on is what's known as counterproductive work behaviors. You can think of this as workplace deviance. These are harmful behaviors, behaviors that are harmful to the organization, to the people within the organization. Right? Behaviors you hope that your colleagues are not doing, some of them are. They're stealing things, right? Being nasty to or rude to clients or customers, insulting or making fun of people, putting them to be paid more hours than they work. Many of these behaviors are private. You can't observe these, but some can be observed. Turns out employees who are lower in guilt-proneness, lower levels, do a lot more of these bad behaviors than employees who are higher in guilt-proneness. I can see this according to their own self-reports. We can see this with their coworker reports of what their coworkers observed, even though coworkers can't see all of these behaviors, right? If you're stealing things at work, you're probably not publicizing that to your colleagues. And so the data here come from a 3-month study I ran where I surveyed employed adults across the US for 12 weeks, over 3 months, every week, asked them to report on their behaviors, their counterproductive work behaviors, their helping behaviors, a lot of other things that I'll talk with you about today. Also had a coworker fill out a survey about them and about their behaviors, a coworker who knew them well. Okay. We can look at those who have relatively low levels of guilt-proneness, compare them to those who have relatively high levels, and you can see here that the individuals with low levels of guilt-proneness that they reported at the beginning of the study, over the course of the 3 months, they did a lot more of these counterproductive work behaviors. Right? Those who are high in guilt-proneness, they did a few maybe, but very, very few. Okay. Turning to organizational citizenship, these are the behaviors you hope your colleagues are doing. Right? The helping behaviors, taking time to advise others, changing schedules, shifts to accommodate others' needs, lending a compassionate ear to people at work when they have problems, going out of the way to express encouragement. The employees who are high in guilt-proneness do a lot more of these positive behaviors as compared to those who are low in guilt-proneness. What's interesting here is the pattern is much more pronounced when we look at the coworker reports. It could be the case that those who are high in guilt-proneness, they don't even realize they're doing these positive behaviors, but their coworkers notice. And so we see that those who are low in guilt-proneness, they do some of these helping behaviors, but much fewer. And they may be doing them for more instrumental reasons, right, for recognition. Okay, so another outcome we looked at in this study is work intensity. When there was a job to be done, I devoted all my energy to getting it done. When I worked, I did so with intensity. I worked at my full capacity in all my job duties. Employees who are higher in guilt-proneness are more likely to agree with these items. And those who are high in guilt proneness, the top 25th percentile I showed here, they are more likely to say that they worked harder at their jobs. This sense of responsibility, this obligation, okay? They devote their efforts toward getting work done. This pattern was first shown by Frank Flynn of Stanford University, Rebecca Schomburg at University of Pennsylvania in a 2012 paper where they showed that employees who are higher in guilt proneness, they worked harder, and because of that, they were more committed to their jobs. And then I replicated it shortly after that in that 3-month diary study that I told you about. One of the limitations of all the data I presented so far is that they're all in research study, anonymous. People weren't motivated to look good. It wasn't a high stakes setting. Well, what do we know about guilt proneness out in the world in a high stakes setting like hiring? There's not as much data available on that, but I do have one study that I want to tell you about today. We surveyed 155 law enforcement job applicants in Colorado, police officers, others who are being considered for hire in public safety. In the state of Colorado, job applicants for public safety positions are required by law to be evaluated by a public safety psychologist to determine their employment suitability. And this involves a large battery of questionnaires, a background check, clinical interview, sometimes a polygraph, an hours-long assessment. It was able to include those 5 guilt proneness items that I presented to you in that battery. Those items weren't used for the evaluation, but we wanted to see, does it map on to the candidate's suitability? And given what we know about guilt proneness, we suspected that it would. And indeed, that's what we found. Even in this setting, where those who would presumably lowest in guilt proneness have probably been filtered out, right? They wouldn't have made it this far in the process. Even here, we see that the individuals who are higher in guilt proneness, in this case, we used a 7-point scale, those who were in the 6 and 7 range, were evaluated more highly. They were highly recommended for employment, whereas those who are in the lower end, even average levels of guilt proneness, so the lower end, they on average were not rated as highly in terms of their employment suitability. So individuals who are higher in guilt proneness compared to their peers, they're more honest in negotiations. They make more favorable impressions on those with whom they negotiate. They commit fewer acts of workplace deviance, fewer illegal behaviors inside and outside the workplace. We can describe them as less dishonest, less abusive towards others, less unethical than their peers. And they commit more organizational citizenship behaviors. They're more helpful, generous, compassionate than their peers. They work harder. They strive to be successful and devote energy and effort toward getting work done. Now, the question you might be asking is why? Why is guilt proneness associated with better job performance? And here we can think about interpersonal responsibility. I found it fascinating that the character and public life panel the other night, the panelists talked about this virtue, about this critically important character trait, and it resonates with my own findings and my own work on guilt proneness. Highly guilt-prone employees feel a strong internal obligation to act responsibly towards colleagues. Right? They don't want to let others down. They would feel guilty for letting others down, doing the wrong thing. And that sense of interpersonal responsibility is helpful for job performance. What evidence can we bring to bear on this? How do we know that this is the mechanism as opposed to, say, generosity or something else? Let me tell you about one research study that demonstrates this link between guilt proneness and interpersonal responsibility. We used a game that psychologists and economists use called the trust game. We called it a choice game. It's a decision-making task involving money between 2 players. Player 1 can send money to player 2. So player 1 can send anywhere from $0 to $20 to player 2. If they send it, the money triples. So if player 1 sends $20, it triples to $60, and then player 2 has the power. They can decide how much money, if any, to give back to player 1. If player 1 sends the money, they're demonstrating that they trust them. They're making themselves vulnerable to them. And our logic here is that when a person makes themselves vulnerable to another by trusting them, it should activate a sense of interpersonal responsibility in the trusted party. Player 1 sends the money to player 2. Player 2 should feel this responsibility. They have been trusted. Right? They've been entrusted with this money. What are they going to do? Are they going to share it? They're going to keep it. walk away. Never going to see this person again. Why not? That's the rational thing to do, right? We hypothesized here that these feelings of interpersonal responsibility should be greater in those who are more guilt prone, and that should be associated with returning the money. Okay, and that is indeed what we found. It's that top line there, that positive slope. When player one sent all of the money, $20 out of $20, it's tripled to 60. How much money did player two send back according to how guilt prone they are? Okay, on the x-axis, we have standardized scores, but on the right side of that, sort of the high end, those who have relatively high levels of guilt proneness, more likely to share the money with the person who trusted them. They are also more likely to agree with statements such as, I felt responsible for my partner's earning. I felt morally obligated to share the money. Okay. Those who are lower in guilt proneness, less likely to endorse those statements, more likely to keep the money, more of the money. What I find also interesting about this study and these results is that bottom line. It's not the case that people who are high in guilt proneness are universally more generous. When their partner signals that they don't trust them, when they only send them $2 out of a possible 20, right? All that value is just wasted. All that money is just wasted because 2's only tripled to 6. So now it's just $6 rather than 60. Right? The guilt proneness it's not related to how much they send back. Right? So the partner hasn't made themselves vulnerable. It hasn't activated that sense of interpersonal responsibility. And there we don't see a relationship. Guilt proneness, where does it matter? When does it matter? It's when those sense of interpersonal responsibility are activated. And because interpersonal responsibility is this mechanism that is associated with behavior, through guilt proneness, by how it affects behavior, it also is linked to leadership. Right? Highly guilt-prone leaders feel a strong internal obligation to act responsibly towards those who depend on them. And this was a relationship first theorized, described by Rebecca Schomburg and Frank Flynn. And then subsequently, I also found some evidence of this with my MBA students in some leadership classes that I teach. And so this is students in a course on managing people in teams. They work with their classmates. All the first-year students at Carnegie Mellon, all the first-year MBA students take this course. As part of this course, we talk about personality and character, understanding yourself, understanding others. So there's a battery of personality questionnaires included that students take for some self-reflection. Turns out the MBA students with higher levels of guilt proneness that's assessed with self-reports at the start of the course, they receive more leadership nominations from their peers at the end of the course, 7 weeks later. Here we define leadership in terms of the ability to build and maintain a group that performs well relative to its competition. So we ask the students at the end of the term, please check the names of classmates whom you regard as highly effective leaders. Okay. Those who are more guilt prone are rated more likely to receive nominations, rated as more effective leaders by their peers. And that's controlling for other things that you think might matter. Their test scores, right? Their how outgoing and extroverted and positive they are, other things that might be associated with leadership. Guilt proneness matters, right? Even on top of those other characteristics, and maybe in many cases even more so than those other characteristics. So what can you look for if you want to try and figure out a person's level of guilt proneness? Would this person feel guilty about committing a transgression or making a mistake, even if no one knew about what they did? Would they feel bad about letting others down or harming them, even if it was not done intentionally? Does this person have a strong sense of responsibility for others? If the answer to any of these questions is no, be really careful about hiring them, careful about promoting them into leadership positions. Right? Think carefully about their level of guilt proneness. Right? Look for character in addition to competence. So how can you do that? Right? The questionnaire I showed you, that 5-item guilt proneness measure, fine for research studies, seems to have some validity out in the world, but there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to rely on a self-report measure, right? In hiring, for example. So what else might you do if you wanted to try and assess a person's moral character, if you wanted to find a way to reveal it, their guilt proneness or moral character more generally? And this is a question that I've been investigating with former doctoral student Young Jung Kim and Abigail Panter of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So we've devised a few questions that are designed to reveal a person's moral character. One of these we call the difficult dilemma question. Please describe an experience in which you were faced with a difficult dilemma at your job, a situation where you found it hard to decide what to do. What factors did you consider? What did you do? What, if anything, did you learn from this experience? Another question. Please tell us about a time you made a mistake at work. How did you feel when this occurred? What did you do? What, if anything, did you learn from this experience? So a number of studies now, we've had interviewees provide written responses to these questions, sometimes one, sometimes both. We have other people, strangers, people who don't know them, read their responses. Try and make a judgment of the person's moral character based on those responses. Turns out, it doesn't matter if you ask one or the other or both, they both provide some information about a person's moral character. And we can see this when we look at the behaviors of the interviewees. I told you about these counterproductive work behaviors. Interviewees who are evaluated as low in moral character based on the written responses to those questions, they commit more of those counterproductive work behaviors, right? A lot more of them, as compared to people who are rated more highly in terms of their moral character. And it doesn't matter if you just read the responses to the dilemma question, the mistake question, or both. Just having the information from one of these seems to be enough to detect the people who have low levels of moral character. And it's not just about self-reported workplace deviance. We've done other studies, laboratory experiments where we can observe cheating and lying. Do people over-report their performance on a problem-solving task to get extra bonus payments when they think we can't tell, although we can? We take their papers out of the recycle bins to see, did they actually score as highly as they told us they did on the payment form? Those who are evaluated by the judges as being lower in moral character, they cheat more, they lie more. What's also interesting about this pattern that you can see with both the questions is that these interview questions do fairly well at differentiating those who do a lot more bad behaviors, a lot of counterproductive behaviors, compared to those who are higher in moral character, but it's not as good as differentiating people with average levels of moral character from those who are higher in moral character. Right? You can see the high bars there are on the left-hand side, and the people who are doing a lot more, right? Those are the people who are evaluated as low in moral character. So we might need other methods to try and identify the morally exceptional or the moral beacons. Right? I want to close this presentation returning to a theme I mentioned in the beginning, this relationship between moral character and organizational culture, right? The person versus the situation. What I presented today is evidence that you should be mindful of moral character, try and hire and promote people with high levels of it, especially guilt-proneness. And you can think of that as hiring person one, shown here. Okay? If you look at this, their ethical behavior over time, on average, look across situations, across time, person one is going to do more ethical behavior than person two or person three. And that's the person we can think of as high levels of moral character. But what you can also see from this figure is that there's variability around everyone's behavior. Maybe person one's having a bad day. Maybe they got in a fight before work. Maybe their kids kept them up all night and they're stressed. Right? Maybe person three, who on average maybe is not the most ethical person, but they're in this great environment where it encourages them to act ethically. So you might see there person three acting more ethically than person one. But if you look across time, right, you can see people have their average way of behaving. And that's why I think of character, I think of personality very much similar to a habit. If you kind of fold your arms across your chest, there's a way you might do that. Try and fold it the other way. Probably feels uncomfortable. You can do it. You can be mindful of it, but it's not as natural. Right? So that's one way we can think about moral character being a person's average way of responding or how they respond over time. But what this also highlights is that it's not enough to just hire people with high levels of moral character, promoting them. And we also have to help bring out the best in others through our own actions, through the culture we help create. We need to create systems that allow people to be their best selves and create an environment where character can shine. I'll close here, open it up for questions. I see there's a few that have come in the Q&A. I want to thank the Character Project at Wake Forest University funding this. I want to thank the organizers of this conference, and I look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, Taya, thank you very much indeed for that absolutely fascinating talk and the incredible research that that you've been doing. There are questions pouring in, as I say, but I wonder if you might start just with a question on guilt-proneness and other character traits. So do you think guilt-proneness is a marker of other character traits, or is it something you think we should cultivate directly? I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, well, I think the answer to both of those questions is yes. And that's why at the beginning I presented to that broad framework. So I think guilt-proneness is related to that motivation to do good, to the consideration of others. We know guilt-proneness is very closely associated with empathy. It's the broad trait that the psychologists sometimes call honesty, humility, which encompasses a person's sincerity, their modesty, their humility. All of these things go together, and they are related to guilt-proneness. Guilt-proneness is also related to things that might be associated with that moral capability, like conscientiousness or self-control, because you feel bad if that helps, you regulate your behavior better. And so what I think is interesting about guilt-proneness is it's related in some ways to all of those three core components of moral character. And so it's not unique in the sense that there's many other virtues, character traits that may also be associated with, say, positive ethical behaviors in the workplace. But I think why I find it so interesting and why it's so powerful in predicting behavior is it taps into all those dimensions. Moral identity, it correlates with measures of that, different things related to motivation and capability. And the question of should we cultivate in the workplace? Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you can encourage people to be mindful of others, encourage a sense of interpersonal responsibility, I think that's going to be helpful for in the workplace and outside the workplace.
Thank you very much. If you do have a question for Professor Cohen, please continue to put those into the Q&A. We've got some wonderful time now ahead for to take some of these questions, and I'll take Richard's question first. Richard asked, to what extent is guilt-proneness fixed? What are the levers for developing moral character in the workplace? And perhaps another one we could take together, how do we increase trait guilt-proneness in an individual who isn't as prone to it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I see it as very similar to other dimensions of personality. So in some sense, it changes. We all mature over time, maybe not everyone, but many people. So across the lifespan, there's been some nice studies that have looked at guilt-proneness across the lifespan. On average, for most of us, it increases, as does other traits associated with maturity, like conscientiousness, honesty, and humility, or others. But at the same time, there's also evidence of stability in that if we look at children, there's been one study, June Tangy and Jeff Stuig and their colleagues have looked at children and guilt-proneness in children. One study, they looked at children in 5th grade when they were 11 years old, tracked them over time till they were 18, wanted to look at things like juvenile delinquency, other kinds of behaviors along those lines. Turns out the children with lower levels of guilt-proneness in the 5th grade, around 11, 12 years old, when they were older, 18, they would have, by the time they were 18, over the course of those years, many of them had issues with juvenile delinquency, more so compared to those who are high in guilt-proneness. But not, of course, not all of them. And you can imagine all the different things in a person's life that would affect that. So it can change. And I think on average, for many of us, it does. But just like the metaphor of a habit, or if you think of personality like a habit, we can change our habits. But it requires often interventions, concerted effort to do so. So I think it is a trait that does emerge early on, has some consistency, relative to peers, but at the same time can change and does change. The other part of that question, what can we do to cultivate it? I think that's sort of as a trait. I think that's it's a hard question because you can't force it on people, right? You can't force people to be responsible. You can't force people to feel bad about their behavior when they do something wrong. But we can think of ways we might encourage that. So that difference between guilt and shame, I think, is an important one. When the person does something wrong, are we focused on making them feel like a terrible person, making them feel like they can't change because it's just who they are? Or are we focused on, no, this was a mistake. This action was something we don't encourage, we don't like. If it's about a specific behavior, think about how do you change the behavior? How do you give people resources to do that? And so that mindset, I think, shifting people more towards focusing when they do something wrong, that they have this, how do you encourage this sense of responsibility? I think that can be helpful. I think another thing I would add, just that can be helpful and for the moral character more generally, is how do we encourage a frame of a decisions we're making that is an ethical frame? And what we know about guilt-proneness, what I know in some of my newer work on moral character, people with high levels of guilt-proneness and other moral character traits, they really do see the world differently. They're more mindful of the moral implications of their choices. When they see that I presented that trust game, when they see a situation like that, a money-making task, for them, it's not necessarily a game or a decision just about making money. It's no, this is a social decision, an ethical decision. There's consequences. And so thinking about how do we encourage people to have that mindset to frame the decisions they make as one in which ethical considerations are relevant. You do that enough times, people start to develop habits, and we can say that maybe as personality change.
Thank you. I wonder if we could, so at one point in the answer you just gave, talking about sense of responsibility, do you see that as the kind of synonym and more positively phrased perhaps than guilt-proneness? Yeah, or is there a distinction between those two? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I think it is the mechanism that drives the behavior. I'm not sure I would call them synonyms, so I see them as separate. So guilt-proneness is really the sense that I would feel bad about my behavior if I did something wrong. That is associated very closely with a sense of interpersonal responsibility. So I do tend to use them interchangeably because I think they are closely linked, although I imagine you could think of separating those, but they do tend to go together. And that's why guilt-proneness or guilt as an emotion corresponds with behaviors associated with taking responsibility for those actions and doing, repair kinds of behaviors, apologizing, trying to do better in the future, which are associated with that sense of responsibility. So we might be able to distinguish them, but they all do seem to coalesce within a person.
Thank you. Thank you. At the end of your talk, you made a fascinating point, not just about individuals, but talking about contexts and cultures and the responsibility not just to encourage people to develop character, but to help them along the way and to create context in organizations where character can thrive. There's a question here from all the way from Hong Kong University. Steve is listening in. What steps do you recommend for organizations to create cultures which cultivate character?
Oh, that's a big one. I think our panelists following me will have great thoughts on this as well. So I think there's a lot in the organizational literature of things that we can think about, and it's a problem that needs a multi-pronged approach. Right? And so we know, for example, from they have really interesting work on goal setting and goals gone wild, how if you have goals that are too ambitious or that people will try and meet them, and that moves people away from their moral compass, let's say, or push or it might take high levels of moral character to resist those pressures. So there's work in that area. How are decisions framed? Are they framed in terms of narrowly around making money, or is it with larger considerations of the different stakeholders involved? What different stakeholders? Is it short-term profits or short-term advantages of any sort, or versus the long-term? And so, because sometimes unethical behavior does lead to these short-term wins, or you can get away with it. Ultimately, though, I think there's long-term costs for in a variety of areas. So, are the organizations run, the leaders who are in place, the way in which managers are framing the decisions to really focus on the short-term or the long-term consequences? So those are some, and certainly not the only ones, but I think those are some of those that are top of mind in terms of what's gotten attention in some of the organizational behavior literature.
Thank you. I think it's an exciting question, a really positive question to be asking and considering. Perhaps we can take that one up in the panel a bit later on, as you say. Kristen has a question. She asks, have you studied the influence of social media and current cultural role models on values, character, and guilt-proneness? Have you studied that, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I haven't studied it directly. I was asked by a journalist somewhat recently who was he did it. It was a really nice report. Was it Discover Magazine? But it's talking about public shaming, which is happening on social media, and humiliation. And so it's talking about guilt and shame in relation to that. And it's really interesting to think of, what is the goal? When people are being shamed on Twitter or humiliated in many cases, or it's been sometimes called our cancel culture, right? I think issues of guilt and shame are become important here, and so when a person is shamed, especially if it's publicly, so are we doing that to try and encourage better behavior? Because what we know about shame and guilt is that globally, broadcasting these behaviors may lead not to repair kinds of behaviors to making it better, but it may lead to more avoidance, withdrawal, closing down, or blaming others. At the same time, sometimes the reason for these sort of public shaming in social media is not for the perpetrator to make them better, because they may be a lost cause, right? It may be to set for our larger societal values of things we want to signal externally. So I think there's sort of interesting questions there of who are we trying to change or motivate through that, say, public admonishment. But anyway, so that's a long way of saying no, I haven't researched it, but I think it is an interesting area of how do we cultivate character traits, virtues through social media, through examples, exemplars. Who do we give attention to? Because it's often the bad actors that generate a lot of attention and controversy, and that can, of course, have negative ramifications for in terms of our role models and whose behavior people might want to model.
Thank you. I wonder if we could talk about the potential downsides for a second, the downsides of character, the downsides particularly of guilt-proneness. I know Adam Grant in his work on generosity talks about potential downsides of generosity, and there's a question around this area as well when it comes to guilt. So someone asks, is it possible that an individual with a high level of guilt-proneness could be taken advantage of or manipulated by an individual who presents a refusal of their own selfish interests as transgressions? If so, how do we prevent this? How do we encourage a high level of guilt-proneness, while kind of mitigating against these possibilities?
That's interesting. I thought that question was going to go in a different direction of feeling too guilty, which also can be a problem. But to the question of, I don't think it's unique to guilt-proneness, but I think, and moral character more generally, there is a risk, all right? Because and you may be missing out on some short-term gains, right? If you have an opportunity to lie and you could get away with it, or you could take advantage of others, free ride on other contributions at the workplace, right? People who are high in guilt-proneness, they're less likely to lie. They're less likely to free ride on others' contributions, like in a group. They're going to be the one working hard, not taking advantage of others. So sure, there's cost to that. I would argue, and I have, that those are often short-term costs, and we look long-term, both for yourself, in terms of how, what kind of person do you want to be? In terms of the long-term consequences for your reputation. So yes, there can be cost in terms of if you are high in guilt-proneness, you may forego opportunities where you could have a short-term gain. I think that's similar to other ethical values, but I'd say the long-term costs are much greater. And related to that, I think one thing that's interesting, I sort of alluded to this when I was mentioning those guilt-proneness item about keeping too much change at a store. I think unlike other negative emotions, let's say anger or sadness, guilt and shame, they don't fade over time in the same way that other emotions do. And if you think about something you've done wrong, I can think about, past behaviors. We can all think back to things we've done wrong. And if we think about that, we still might feel just as bad as at the time it happened. It doesn't go away. We focus on other things, and hopefully they're not consuming us. So I think that's powerful. And as people get older, I do think that maybe one of the reasons guilt-proneness does increase over time is because we have that recognition that, I could get away with something there, maybe I could get taken advantage of, but there's a cost to that. And so a few other things that I did related to that question. The difference I showed in the trust game between the sense of interpersonal responsibility versus just overall generosity. It's not the case that people who are high in guilt-proneness are just overly generous and giving and putting themselves out there in all situations, they are tuned to how much people are depending on them and relying on them. And so, if you're worried about being taken advantage of, I think it is be careful, be mindful of that. Is someone making themselves vulnerable? Do you have a sense of responsibility? Or, if are you in a situation where you could be taken advantage of? So maybe enter those situations more cautiously. So I think those things can coexist. And then the other downside, I would say, the guilt proneness that comes up is if you're feeling guilty about things that you haven't done, things, if it's consuming, right? This guilt proneness as the character trait is feeling bad when you've done something wrong. So or anticipating that you would feel bad if you've done something wrong, just feeling guilty or bad about your behavior more generally, ruminating, those kinds of characteristics, I'd say, are different than guilt proneness, and they're outside of it. And those obviously would not be psychologically healthy or adaptive.
That's really helpful. So we're talking about kind of well-moderated, properly
right.
moderated guilt proneness. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think the time horizons point as well on the first question about, yes, there's a risk of being taken advantage of, but what game are we playing? What are the horizons?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or are we playing a game or not? Even yes, exactly.
Is there, as you talk about some of these other aspects here and some of the other things that might need to be cultivated too, are there other character virtues you think are going to be really natural partners with guilt proneness then, in order to make sure it's moderated well and kind of properly configured to the reality of situations?
That's a really fascinating question. I mean, what wouldn't be, I guess, is, it's, how do we rank order the virtues? And, so I don't know. It's hard to point out one. I mean, there's certain ones that I find really interesting to study. And right now I'm part of a team with some psychologists, philosophers at Wake Forest University. We're studying honesty. So I've been focused a lot on honesty and communicating what one believes to be true, fostering understanding of others, seeking out truthful information. And so that's what I think those things do go along with guilt proneness. People who are guilt prone are more honest, and but also trustworthiness, integrity. These things all have natural connections, even honest, and humility also. Guilt proneness involves a deep consideration of other people, because you're thinking about how are your own actions affecting others? What is my obligation, my duty to other people? What's my responsibility to them? So I think many of these character traits, compassion, humility, integrity, courage, even, because it's my obligation, I have to speak up. And I think these go together, and there's natural relationships, but also even others that might seem more disconnected. I was thinking of Dr. Crew is talking about other virtues like temperance. For example, maybe that's related to self-regulation, which, you feel guilty if you have a lapse of self-control or you don't live up to your intentions or values. So I think this is why I've become so interested in guilt proneness study and why it powerfully predicts behavior, because it does touch on and connected to many different character traits, maybe more and perhaps more so than other virtues that we might think of, but it has more overlap. It's at the intersection of many of them.
Thank you. Jonathan has a question here. In your research, have you found a tendency that people with high guilt proneness become paralyzed in making decisions because they're so concerned with other people's feelings, other people's viewpoints?
I think it's logical. I see the logic to the question. I haven't seen that. More so with shame proneness, perhaps. What's interesting, and this gets back to the point that being guilt prone is not the same as being guilt ridden. And so there it is, like, if I did something wrong, would I feel appropriately bad about it? As opposed to being overly attentive to it to the point where it may be debilitating. Shame proneness, on the other end, and these things they do go together, but we can distinguish them. If you're feeling bad about yourself, if you're feeling, how am I going to be judged, evaluated? I have this potentially a flawed sense of self. That is associated much more so with rumination, with depression, with other more negative psychological functioning. So that it may lead to that indecision. So I think it is certainly possible that if a person is at the extreme too guilt prone that maybe they're or too empathic might be the more empathy than guilt proneness per se. If they're too empathic, they could be overly attentive to others, and that could hinder them from being able to make some hard decisions, or maybe even lead to indecision. But I don't think it's necessarily the case, because part of guilt proneness, especially again linking it to that sense of responsibility, is you also might feel a responsibility to make a decision, whatever it is, even if it's a hard decision, even if it doesn't satisfy everyone. If you feel like it's your obligation to act, if you're put in that role, then you may, feel guilty for not for indecision. So I think it's one that within some people or in some circumstance could lead to that, but not generally, because it depends on what do you feel this obligation to do, and that's what guilt proneness should motivate.
Thank you. Jeannie has a question. Are there careers or professional areas where someone with high guilt proneness would be more likely to find like-minded workers or greater success due to this character trait?
I think it's a great question. Do we have profiles of different careers, occupations? So if to be successful, you have to be unethical, you have to harm others, you have to act in untrustworthy ways or lying, that would not be a career where a guilt-prone person would thrive. I don't think many careers require that. I hope, some might, but certainly moral character may be better suited for some than others. So that leadership role, I think, if people rely on you and depend on you, and the metric of success is, are you able to act responsibly for people who depend on you, then I think that would fit well for a person who's guilt prone. If it's a career occupation where it's just about yourself and very individual focus, where your actions are only for you, then I don't see guilt proneness as being particularly well suited for that, because guilt proneness is this interpersonal kind of characteristic, guilt being an interpersonal emotion. So careers where a sense of responsibility is important, people rely on you, where you can have a positive impact on others, I think those are ones where guilt proneness might thrive. And then I was thinking it's really interesting to think about, our character and public life panel that I thought was very thought-provoking. We think of politicians, and the panelists there we're talking about the importance of, say, interpersonal responsibility, feeling beholden to others, humility, integrity, all these characteristics as being really important for politicians. Yet what we often see on the news and the headlines and all the bad behavior is people who are not living those values, or may not be, or at least in terms of some of the media attention. And then it's question, like, would guilt proneness be good in politics? Or would, is feeling that sense of responsibility, feeling like I would feel bad if I let people down, is that positive or negative? And to me, that's an open question. I think an interesting one, and I think the same kind of question could be asked for certainly for other careers as well.
Time is running away. It'd be lovely to have much longer. Always be good. But this has been a super conversation. Perhaps we could end with this question, which I think is a really good one, about demographic distinctions. So are there any regional differences in guilt proneness, or geographic ones, or international ones that you've come across? Or are there other demographic differences, such as race or gender, that you found?
So no differences that we've observed in studies of race, but yes, on gender. You can guess, women or men. Would open it up to the audience if I could do a quick poll on what you think. But the answer for we found from our data is women tend, on average, not everyone, of course, on average, tend to be a little higher in guilt proneness than men. And we could, I'm sure, have long conversations. Is this a nature nurture? Probably some combination, right? I mean, women being more oriented towards others through socialization and maybe other things as well. But women do tend to be higher on guilt proneness than men on average. We have data across, several different countries. This measure I've developed has been used in dozens of countries throughout the world, different languages. I don't know of any. It's hard to make cross-cultural comparisons, so I don't know about differences in levels of guilt proneness or shame proneness or other things. But certainly, we might suspect that if a culture or a group really fosters a sense of connection to other people, responsibility for others in your community, that may bring out a person's guilt proneness. But it's really hard to draw conclusions about, at the national level, especially in the globalized world we live in today. And so the data on that has not been this shown sort of many differences. That's not to say they don't exist. And then the other question people often ask, we're talking about guilt and shame, is the role of religion. And many people you can think, so oh, well, are Jews like this and Catholics like this and, Protestants like this and all these things. This, I think people have a lot of intuitions about. The data we've collected does not suggest differences among different religious groups. People from all religions can feel guilty, can feel ashamed. And so I'll leave it at that. That was sort of a question we thought. I grew up with an American Jewish family. Guilt is sort of so central to Jewish upbringing and is part of the cultural values. And so that always resonated with me. But it turns out people who are Christian, people who are Muslim, people of all different religious backgrounds also share a lot of these values, even if it's inculcated or in different ways, even if it looks different in terms of the specific behaviors, but no average differences that we've shown. So gender is the only one that, and age, people become more guilt prone or are more guilt prone as they get older. There's an association there. So those are the two big demographic ones.
Professor Cohen, that has been a tour de force for which I know our audience watching from around the world are incredibly grateful. That was incredibly stimulating. Thank you very much indeed for the research that you're doing and investing your life into, and for sharing it with us today so powerfully and so helpfully. Thank you so much for your contribution to the conference.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. I look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this session today. We will have a short 15-minute break right now, and we'll be back at 1:15 Eastern in 15 minutes time on this same link for our panel discussion on character and business. So to continue the conversation, back here in 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to our panel on character and business. We've just had a fantastic keynote from Professor Ty Cohen, thinking about guilt-proneness, job performance, and leadership potential. And now we have a terrific panel lined up as well to take on our discussion on character and business. A quick note before we begin to say that I'm afraid the Q&A, while it was open for the keynote, won't be open for this panel due to the limited time, but there is a fascinating discussion lined up with Dr. Reem and our tremendous group of panelists. It's indeed my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our panel, who is Dr. Michelle Reem, who is the interim dean, of the Wake Forest School of Business and the Peter C. Brockway Chair of Strategic Management. She is a leading expert on business communication, branding, and consumer behavior, and has published numerous articles and research papers in a variety of top-tier academic journals. We are delighted that she is moderating this afternoon's panel. Over to you, Dean Reem.
Thank you, Ed, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Hello and good afternoon. We are so pleased you could be with us for the Character and Business panel. I have the absolutely great privilege and pleasure of moderating what I can only imagine will be a very lively discussion with an esteemed set of panelists this afternoon. And I'd like to start things off by just introducing each of them briefly, and we'll go in alphabetical order. So Larry Kull is a business executive who is currently serving as chairman and CEO of the General Electric Company. Larry has also served on the Wake Forest Board of Trustees since 2015. Welcome, Larry. Mary Gentile is a professor of practice at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business and the creator director of Giving Voice to Values, which is a business curriculum for values-driven leadership that has been implemented in over 1,260 business schools and organizations globally. Welcome, Mary. Sean Hanna is the Tylee Wilson Chair of Business Ethics and a professor of management at the Wake Forest University School of Business. Sean was the founding director of our Legacy Center for Leadership and Character at Wake Forest, and he currently serves in that center as a senior research associate. Welcome, Sean. Carolyn Wu is the former president and CEO of Catholic Relief Services, which is the official humanitarian agency of the U.S. Catholic community. Before taking the helm there, Carolyn was the dean of the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. And welcome, Carolyn. So thank you to our panelists for joining us today. I know we're all looking forward to hearing your thoughts on just a number of topics that reside at the intersection of character and business. And my hope is we can pick up on a couple of themes that came from the keynote speech that directly preceded us. Just a little programming note in case you missed it, if you were joining us as Ed gave us the introduction. If you're joining us as an audience participant, we will be focusing our conversation today on interaction between our panelists, among our panelists. So the chat function is not enabled currently to allow live questions. But if you do have a thought that you'd like to share with the panel, please do pop it into the Q&A, which I believe should be at the bottom of your screen, and it will absolutely be available to them and can be available to our planners to inform future programming. So thank you in advance for that. So I think that's all the preliminaries. Let's dive right in, shall we? I'd like to start us off by just kind of picking up a train of thought that does come from Dr. Cohen's presentation. She spoke at length about a particular moral character trait, which was guilt-proneness. And I'd like to broaden our scope just a bit, but maybe double click on that general idea of moral character traits. And so here's my question to the panel. Interested to hear what character traits or virtues have been particularly important to you in your career, and why have they been important? And we'll allow each of our panelists to respond. I'd like to invite Professor Sean Hanna maybe to lead us off. Sean.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. And it's an honor to be here on this esteemed panel today. So I'm really looking forward to engaging with my fellow panelists here. One thing that Michelle didn't tell you is I spent 26 years in the United States Army prior to joining academia. I've been in academia now for about 18 years. And so we're all products, our character, we're products of our environment and our experiences that we've had over our life cycle, particularly during those more formative years. A lot of the character and the values and the beliefs that I've inculcated are from those earlier experiences in the Army. The 7 Army values: loyalty, duty, honor, selfless service, integrity, personal courage, and respect, which, by the way, kind of spells leadership. If you look at the different first letters of each of those words. And, you know, you heard Taya talk a lot about a lot of those attributes too. And so the question is, well, why do we inculcate values? Why do we choose to internalize some values and not others? And the answer is because we find some to be functional. They work. They help us to be successful. They help our organizations to be successful. They allow us to maintain honor and effectiveness and integrity in our organizations and long-term sustainability. So I grew up with these 7 Army values, the various combat and contingency operations, and I used to think they were just for soldiers until on 9/11, when the Pentagon got attacked. I was asked to come in and stand back up the organization that had the direct hit, lost 84% of its personnel. And these were all civilians. These were not soldiers. These were Department of the Army accountants and comptrollers and financial managers. And I had no idea whether they were going to come back to work the next day after such a horrific incident to happen like that. And when I walked in the next morning, every single survivor was back in the office, ready to stand back up and accomplish the mission. And this organization, as I said, had been devastated, had the largest casualty rates in the Pentagon attack. And I started talking to them and finding out, why are you here? And why are you back so engaged? And everything they talked about related to those same values. They were there under loyalty to support their team members. They knew that a lot of their team members would come back. They talked about a sense of duty toward the mission, toward accomplishing the mission. Obviously, a lot about courage to walk back in after an incident like that and pull themselves back up on the horse again and to be able to operate. A lot of them talked about this idea of course, selfless service, that they came back because they had a mission to accomplish. Their focus wasn't just to take care of themselves, but to come back and take care of their teammates, take care of the mission that needed to be accomplished. So it's when we find values and beliefs, and if these are also character strengths when we think about it, things like loyalty and duty, you heard Taya talk about them, as also strengths of the individual. If we truly take those in and hold them to be important, they start to drive our behavior, and they can be inculcated in others. We can hopefully talk about that a little bit more, but that would be pretty much my answer for you, Michelle. So 7 Army values, and a lot of those shaped what I do as a scholar. When I came into the scholarly world, I was really surprised there was not a theory about duty. And so some colleagues and I created a theory called duty orientation. We created a theory called moral potency, which has the elements of taking ownership over our moral environment, having confidence to execute morality in that environment, and the courage to stand up and do what's right. And I think the more and more we need to have this conversation and use these kind of words that some people might call kind of quaint, more in our business schools and in our businesses. So that'll yield the floor.
Thank you, Sean. We are off to a great start, and I can say I have the pleasure of working alongside Sean, and I can tell you that his students are very quick to recognize those 7 core values as ways that he runs his classroom and ways that he models behavior for his students. So thank you for shaping that up for us. Larry, I wonder if I could ask you to jump in.
Happy to, and thank you again for having me to join the group this afternoon. It's good to be back on campus, albeit virtually. You know, I would say that 2 traits have been important to me on my leadership journey. The first being humility, the second being empathy. And we actually talk a lot about humility at GE. A year ago, in fact, we rolled out our 3 new leadership behaviors. Humility was one of them. In large part because we were trying to underscore the importance for leaders to feel comfortable, to actually encourage leaders to ask questions as opposed to issue declarations. And that's a little bit of a leadership model shift, but I've just come to believe over a long period of time, leading a range of different businesses, that leaders shape conversations, and they shape conversations by the questions that they ask. And that really sets a tone for an organization that can be very powerful. But beyond asking good questions, right, leaders have to be active listeners with the heartfelt view that you can learn from others, regardless of where they sit in your organization, even if they're 3 levels down from where you are. And I've just found that as I've been fortunate to have more senior roles over the course of my career, that reality is all the more important to remember and really operationalize, if you will, day in, day out. But I would say related to that, humility is about the idea that no matter how successful you are, no matter how good you or your team are performing, you can always be better, right? And in a lot of organizations, it's hard to admit that, right? That no matter how well a month or a year has gone, there are always opportunities to improve, what the Japanese would call kaizen, right? And to me, that's all wrapped up in humility. And humility is not that far removed from the importance of empathy. And again, it ties, I think, by way of active listening. Whether it's your boss, whether it's a set of peers, whether it's the people that you're responsible for, really having the ability to put yourself in their shoes day in, day out, I just think is incredibly important. It's not always easy. Sometimes people will tell you exactly where they are, and in other times, not so much. But similarly, some of the best new product and commercial leaders that I've ever seen have a wonderful ability to hear what customers say, sometimes hear what customers don't say, and really drive an organization to invest and deliver on innovations with those customer needs in mind, as opposed to what a couple of smart marketers and engineers might have cooked up in their own laboratory. So, I mean, for me, humility and empathy over time have really kind of risen to the top of that list.
Thank you so much for reminding us of just the power of even just human-to-human interaction and how much that can convey in terms of building a culture of character. I'd like to invite Carolyn to jump in at this point.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and to tie in all these different speakers. It really is enlightening. I want to say the values that form my character came from very early. It actually came from growing up in a Chinese family. And we were a post-World War II family. I was born about 10, 12 years after the war, but my older siblings, my parents, relatives, they all came through really difficult times of World War II and then the change in government regime in China. Many of them were refugees. So I grew up in a family where it was always we. There is no I. There's I, but it's the we that matters. I don't even know how old I was when my father would say, take care of your brothers and sisters. That is always, we have a responsibility to each other. We have family. So from a very early age, there is this sense of responsibility, which drove me in my whole career. It was not the desire for success. It was really, how would I take care of my family? Therefore, I need an education. How would I get my scholarship? It was always a sense about that responsibility. And I think that expanded into is not just responsibility for your family, but for the people who employ you. There's a sense of the organization that relies on you. There is a sense that your colleagues also rely on you. There's a sense that the people you serve, whether they're your students, your patients, and so on, that you also have a responsibility to them. And I think as I grow older, it broadens into what I would call a sense, the capacity for the other. I think Taya talked about guilt-ridden. That's not guilt-ridden, but guilt-prone. But I think there is a sensitivity of your action on other people and feeling that you may have not done your best and that you may have let people down or in some situations actually hurt them. Larry talked about the ability to listen, to be humble, and that is to recognize that other people have something to teach you. I think leadership requires you to develop other people. You have to be for them. If you're not for them, they're not going to come along. So Michelle would say, for me, it's really starting with that sense of responsibility for others, the sense of that I don't prosper if we don't prosper. And in the process is the capacity for others. I would say those.
Thank you. Mary, would you like to weigh in at this point?
Yes, thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor to be in this conversation. So when I thought about this question, I don't really think of this in terms of virtue, but I think a core part of my character is something that I call the search for the convergence between the private and the public good. And what I mean by that is, for whatever reason, I always felt sort of a desire to feel that my life mattered. I think there's more and more research now about, what leads to people to move into despair, cynicism, depression, and how people cope with challenges like our whole world is going through right now. And a lot of it has to do with a sense of meaning and being part of some sort of bigger meaning. So I always felt that very acutely. I wanted to serve some sort of public good, some sort of public meaning. But when I was younger, the way I tried to do that was perhaps a little misguided. I would sit down with pieces of paper. I mean, there's many of these in my diaries and journals from younger years, but I'd make lists, what are my skills? What am I capable of doing? And then I'd make another list of what does the world need? And I would try and find the convergence, right? The problem with that is that, of course, we all have certain skills and gifts. And of course, there are many needs in the world and you can find the match. It doesn't mean it's something that you want to do. And so I would find these matches and I'd try and force myself into that, that peg in that hole, which didn't necessarily bring me any satisfaction or happiness. And so at a certain point in my life, I realized that I needed to find the convergence between that public good and the private good. That is what made me happy, what made me feel satisfied. And when I started thinking about it that way, and I think that is part of my character, is looking for that Venn diagram, the place where my happiness, my satisfaction, my sense of accomplishment overlaps with what can be useful and positive and contribute to a wider public good. Finding that overlap is really, I think, what's guided me in my career, and it's been what's led me to the places where I've felt the most successful.
Thank you. If I had to draw a connection between the comments of our panelists here, I think we're getting a strong sense of just the importance of having a sense of something larger than ourselves and feeling a responsibility and an accountability to that larger entity. I'd like to kind of continue in this train of thought, sort of reflecting on your career and what's been important. I know that we have a number of students in our audience today. And so for their benefit, I wonder if each of you could share with us an example, maybe a role model or just an exemplar, someone who has been especially important in shaping your understanding of character, your exercise of character, and how has that example impacted you? So Larry, would love to invite you to the floor first.
Happy to do this. This is, I think, the question where I potentially get kicked out of the conversation, because I'll say something that's maybe inappropriate, given that we not only have a number of Wake Foresters on the podium, but we've got a Wahoo from UVA and Carolyn from Notre Dame. But my dad went to Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina. So I grew up a big North Carolina basketball fan. And I think one of the most impactful role models for me, frankly, was Coach Dean Smith. I didn't play for Coach Smith. I didn't go to Carolina, but grew up, I think, watching and really admiring a basketball program led by somebody that really, I think, instilled in his team, and I would argue the university, many of the values that Carolyn was speaking to a moment ago, that it was all very much about the team, and the team won and the team lost, despite all the terrific players that went through that program over decades. I don't think I've been disconnected, so thank you. I'll go on for a moment. But so many wonderful lessons, but one that I remember vividly was the custom that Coach Smith would have his players use after they scored a basket. Often when the camera, or at least the crowd's eyes were on the player that had just scored, and that's when that player would point to the other player on the court who'd passed them the ball, right? To say thank you and to acknowledge that you don't score without somebody out on the court being helpful in that regard. And I think those are the sorts of small but important behaviors that over time really do reinforce these ideas of teamwork, collaboration, being in pursuit of something bigger than yourselves. So while that was a long time ago, those lessons from Coach Smith, I think, still influence how I lead today.
Thank you. I do feel maybe a responsibility to throw a Go Deeks in here to counter the Carolina example.
Of course.
Thank you. It's very powerful. Sean Hanna, would you like to add to the conversation?
Sure. My research and my just general beliefs are that we don't necessarily have just major role models, but we take little pieces from various role models and anti-role models too, people we don't want to be like. And some of my research is all about moments that matter, trigger events, things that we have these moments that'll stick with you forever and kind of have that indelible, difference on you. And I'll just throw out just a couple of examples. I remember when I went to Ranger School as a young officer. It's an individual school. You don't go through it as a unit. It's all about, are you tough enough to make it through this and good enough to get through the other side? And I was an officer when I went through. There's no rank in Ranger School. Everybody's treated the same. And your instructors are mostly sergeants, and they're going to tell you what in the heck to do. And I had this one sergeant who he just beat up the officers in the course all the time. And, I thought it was something personal with him. But I'll never forget on graduation day, he came up to us and he said, "Hey, I want to tell you why I've been so tough on you." And he said, "I haven't been training you to be Rangers. I've been training you to be the type of leader that Rangers will look up to and follow." And from that day forward, I always wear the Ranger tab on my left sleeve. It's on all of our uniforms. And every day I would just remember that sergeant, that kind of a gut check. Am I holding myself to even higher standards than I expect those that follow me to be held to? And I often let that down. I'm not standing up and telling you that I always was successful at that, but it would cause me to always ask myself, am I being a role model? Am I leading the way? Am I being the type of leader that other people will want to follow? Just give you one other quick example. On the eve of battle in Operation Desert Storm, we had been training for weeks to get the fight started, and we were about ready to launch the main attack force. I was part of the main attack force. We had 150,000 soldiers in one formation ready to move across the Iraqi desert. And we had been thinking about nothing but closing with and destroying the enemy for weeks now, perfecting our craft. And the very last words that our commander said before we took off was, "We may defeat the enemy, but we won't be winners unless we win with honor." And here in that moment, when we're getting ready to unleash the lethal force of the United States of America on an enemy force, the last word that they wanted us to remember was, "Do it with honor, fight with honor." And that's just something I think is critical in business. In business, capitalism demands that we fight for the fittest. That's what makes the system work, right? How can I provide the best value? But you've got to win with honor while you're doing it.
Thank you, Sean. Mary, would you like to add a powerful example?
Sure. I agree with what Sean was saying about how there are lots of people that we learn different things from, good and bad, and also that there are these moments that are important. So I want to share a moment and one individual that I think had an important influence on me. The work I do is all around giving voice to values, right? And it grew partly out of my own sense of disempowerment when I was younger. I'm an introvert. I wasn't somebody who saw myself as someone who was going to stand up for what's right, even though I was the kind of person who tended to notice things that I thought weren't right. And so this was a tension for me. And I remember when I first went to work, I worked for 10 years at Harvard Business School. And when I was first there, I was very junior, and I was always in the minority as a woman in whatever setting I happened to be in at the time. I can remember that I stayed silent a lot. I also had come from a non-traditional background. I didn't want to be showing my ignorance or my naivete or just speaking in a way that wasn't, part of the culture. And so I silenced myself a lot. And I remember sitting in a faculty meeting one time. So there's like 80 or 90 faculty in the room. And there was another young junior faculty member there, a woman who also was fairly new. She also came from the South. So she had a pretty heavy Southern accent, which was kind of unusual. I mean, she was probably the only one at the school with that kind of accent. So there were a lot of stereotypes that kind of worked against her a little bit. And I remember that she just would speak up in these meetings, and she would speak in a way that was totally culturally different. It was not just her accent, it was the things that mattered to her, the way the lens she used to look at the world. And they were always very important viewpoints. They were sometimes heard and not always heard. But I remember sitting there one day listening to her do this yet again when I was silencing myself and thinking, I kind of have a choice here. I can either ride under the radar and stay quiet and nobody will really know if I fit in or not, but at least they won't know I don't. Or I can just sort of be who I am as she was doing. And some people will hear it and some people won't. But, what world do I want to live in? And that really, it was like a moment for me. We have those moments, as Sean was saying, that matter. And so I would say, Mimi Drumright.
You know what I love about these stories is that it really reminds us that these people who leave lasting impressions on us, some of them are people that have a particular stature, Dean Smith, but some are just people that we encounter. And so it's a good reminder that we can always be that person to someone else who would be observing us. Carolyn, would you like to bring your story?
Yeah, I have tidbits of stories. In Hong Kong, I was actually educated by American missionaries. So if you folks wonder where do these people go, they came to China, they were expelled, they came to Hong Kong, they were my teachers. I learned two things from them. One was that they were passionate about educating these girls, these little Chinese girls with pigtails and so on. I don't know what they saw in us, but they were passionate. They never had enough money, but that never stopped them. So we participated in a lot of fundraisers. But the first thing I learned from them was that money was not the biggest obstacle if you want something done. The other thing I learned from them, I was in that school for 12 years. Hong Kong was extraordinarily competitive. If you were in a school system, in grade 6 and then grade 11 and then grade 12, you have to sit for public exams and you're graded from A to H. So there was a very, the curve was very punishing. And somehow they created a culture of friendship, of camaraderie. They somehow fostered this sense that we're in this together with all my friends since first grade, and some of them kindergarten are still very good friends today. And we were brought up in a very competitive environment. It was elimination. And somehow that always stayed with me. I find sometimes in the US that the competitive spirit really enters into the wrong places. And finally, I worked for the provost of Purdue. I was drafted into the provost office. I have never done any provost type of work. I was associate provost, and I witnessed how power is used the first time in my life. Look, I mean, I was a professor, and then I ran the MBA programs, and I graded, I guess, so I can give people C's or D's, but that was not the exercise of power. But in the first time, I see sort of in the provost office, promotion, denial of tenure, saying yes to various programs, no, allocating resources, and a lot of times saying no. So it was really quite a good demonstration and mentoring to me to see, and of course I was intimidated. I wish not to have to make those decisions as an academic, but it's to learn what are the key values you have to hold when you make decisions with this type of power over the influence of people's life. So I always appreciated, and what he said was that, what is your North Star? Going into this, what do you owe the people that you're evaluating? What do you owe the organization which put you in that type of a position? And what do you owe the other people who are the peers of this person? So I just say that was a major sort of formation experience for me.
Thank you. And thank you to each of the panelists for sharing very inspiring stories that I know will stay with me long after the session today. I'd like to continue on with just sort of the theme of developing character muscles. So one way that happens is by observing role models, but let's just kind of broaden things a little bit here. I know we all on the panel have affiliations with universities, and because of that, we think just an awful lot about the educational context in which character can be developed. And this question is going to link to something that came up in the Q&A for Dr. Cohen's presentation. So I'm curious on your thoughts about how character can be educated or improved. And what, as leaders, what is the role of a leader in facilitating this education? Mary, would you like to jump in first?
Sure. So this is kind of what all my work is around, is sort of values-driven leadership development. And it grew, the approach that I think that I have developed and that I think is effective for a lot of different reasons, really grows out of something that I think Taya referred to in her Q&A session as well. But it has to do with, she talked about moral motivation, moral ability, and moral identity. And it's really more around moral ability. So this kind of grew out of my frustration with the way when I was working at Harvard Business School and when I was working with companies that trying to develop these skills, the approach tended to be one that was entirely cognitive. It was kind of giving people scenarios and then sharing with them decision-making frameworks and models, lenses, to try and decide what the appropriate thing to do is, what the moral and ethical thing to do is in any particular business situation. I call it the preach and pretend method, because it was kind of like we preach about what's right and then we pretended that people could do it. And what I saw so often is that, of course, there are always some bad actors, but that what I saw both with the business practitioners I worked with and with the MBA students that I worked with, was that a lot of them really kind of knew when something was wrong, you know, some of the obvious things, not the more subtle, really, really gray areas, but a lot of the things that actually get us into major scandals, they kind of knew, but they actually just, and they didn't necessarily want to do it, but they didn't feel that there was a choice. And so so that was sort of the observation. And I felt in a way, the way we were teaching this was almost a schooling for sophistry, because I would sit in these classroom discussions and people would learn, you know, utilitarianism and deontology and virtue-based ethics, and they'd look at a scenario and there were many ways that you could frame it from those different angles. That's good for disciplining your thinking, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to act. I remember interviewing a CEO who told me that he had been interviewing a recent MBA grad from a top business school who told him that in his ethics class, he learned all the models of ethical reasoning. And then he learned when you encounter a values conflict, you should decide what you want to do and then select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do. Now that's not exactly what the professor had in mind. And so when I started to see that and feel that frustration, and also started to recognize more and more research from neurosciences and behavioral ethics and social psychology that suggested that if you really want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal, pre-scripting, practice, and peer coaching are much more effective ways of doing so. And so the approach that I take and the approach that I've seen a lot of impact with is actually what we call post-decision making. We give people scenarios where the right answer, the ethical answer, the answer you would like to promote in your organization as a responsible leader is in the scenario. And the question is, how could you get that done? What would you need to say? What would the pressures be? How would you address them? And it triggers a different kind of thinking, you know, it triggers the innovation and the creativity. And it also gives people that opportunity to practice that. So even people who maybe don't come in with that higher guilt-proneness, as Taya referred to it, or sense of interpersonal responsibility, as I think Carolyn referred to it, even if they don't come in with that, they're given the opportunity to work with peers who are the same kinds of people they would work with in these organizations to craft a strategy, a script, an action plan that is likely to be successful. So that's how I think about that.
Thank you. I believe Carolyn also has a project at her university that she would like to tell us a bit about.
Yes. So, by the way, Mary's work on giving voice to values is really a must in training people how to speak their truth. I want to say, first of all, I'm going to make a statement. I think that we need to teach people right from wrong, and that they don't know right from wrong is wrong-headed thinking. There's a lot of research that shows that if nothing is on the line, if you ask, you know, is truth telling right? Yes. Is lying wrong? Yes. Is whatever, that across the board, very, very robust findings that say people know what is right from what is wrong. So the issues that we face in ethical misbehavior, I think, is not that people do not know what is right from wrong, but they do not do what they know to be right. Knowing does not lead to doing. That's the biggest issue. So we approach it in two levels. One is at the level of personal formation. The other, of course, is you have a later question of what do professional ethicists in companies or whatever, how do they approach this? But I want to talk about the person. So we have this experience, we call it the character project. It's not a course, it's not an ethics course, but it's about character, which is the alignment of what you believe in, what you say you are, and how you really behave. It is a spring course. We only take 24 students, half female, half male. They tend to be juniors and seniors. Before they go away for the Christmas vacation, we give them a survey. It's over 100 questions. And it's really sort of for them to think about how they would act in different situations. They have a lot of time to think about it. They therefore take it seriously. We invite them to draw in other people to give comment about how they would do. But it's choices like, you know, oh, if you have to break up with someone, do you just stay away? Or do you text the person? Do you ask to meet in person? How do you want to manage that? Under what conditions would it be good to renege on a former plan? You know, people make plans on Monday and they say, be sure to save a seat on Uber for me. But then on Thursday, they say, oh, I have this big paper due. I'm sorry, I can't join you Friday. But that's because they found something better to do. So there are a lot of these situations in the daily life of students and some broader questions. And so we start with, well, how would you do this? Do you want to tell the truth? Yes. If you have a friend who has a major sort of misbehavior problem, how would you approach this? They would say, well, gingerly, and never tell the truth and say, this is not good for your health or something like this. So we start with that. They come back with their answers. And we really use a chain, which is to say, the way you make decisions reflect your values, right? When you say, it's okay to stand up someone or change my plans when, you know, the newer plans are so much more exciting. If I had known it was coming, I wouldn't have done this or whatever. What does it say about you, your priorities, your preferences? What is important to you? So we take the decisions and then we go back to values. We say your values drive your decisions, and you have to be honest about your values. Your decisions will drive your actions. Repeated actions will develop into habit. Ty talk about habits. Good habits become virtues, bad habits become vices, and it defines your character. So we take them through and we, you know, at a certain point, they think about their habits and so on. But then we stopped there and then we said, in order to really have your character, you have to reclaim, who do you want to be? Who do you want to be at your best? You know, and what they would tell you is that, well, at my best, I want to be this. And we'll say, where did that come from? Where does this vision come from about you at your best? And it would come from scriptures. I mean, Notre Dame is a Catholic school. 85% of the kids are Catholic. And then the other thing is they would say, my grandmother thinks that I'm just a really class act. My third grade teacher, Sister Mary, who had catechism, think that I am just the best kid. So it also recovers how important parents are. The people who bring these young people up to give them a sense of who they are. So they start with there and then they say, how do I close the gap? And I just want to use, so, and then at the end, there's a lot of readings, but there's a project. The last project was for them to reflect on where there was a gap in who they like to believe they are and how they acted, and that there was this misalignment and how they would deal with it. So we did this for 5 years, 24 with lots of papers. But that one that stuck in my mind was a kid who said, I applied to medical school. I'm a good student and I want to be a doctor. They all asked me, why do I want to be a doctor? And he said, well, the standard line you have to say, because you want to serve other people. He said, well, I do want to serve them, but I just want a high-paying profession. You know, I didn't come from money. I just want a profession where I could make money. That was my approach. But I, you know, of course, what you should say is you want to cure people. And he said, I didn't get all the acceptances. He did get some. He said, my grades my scores, test scores, would stand me in like the top 3% of applicants, but I didn't get all the applicants at all the schools. And he said, perhaps they sensed that I was insincere. Perhaps they sensed that I was just giving them a line. And he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to postpone entering medical school by 1 year, and I'm going to go join a service operation just so that now I could stand behind my word and that I wanted to do service. Now, this is kind of a funny way of, of changing that, but it was the first step, and say, I am going to make good on something I said about myself, which was a throwaway line. And now, for my own sake, I want to make it true. So that's the character project.
Thank you. Sean, I believe you are unmuted. Would you like to jump in next?
Sure. And, actually, I'd like to build on what Carol and Mary just talked about. I agree with Mary. I think way too many business schools, for example, spend too much time in business ethics classes talking about ethical decision making and how do you make the optimum decision when, Larry, I'm sure, is probably the most equipped of all of us to talk about. That's hard to do, especially when you're a senior leader in a company where you're not dealing with necessarily just right versus wrong issues. Those are the easy ones. Those are the ones what's right. That's just an issue of do I have the courage and the sense of ownership and things like that to do what's right. What's tough is the right versus right decisions. Is it right to take profits from the company and improve the benefits and well-being of our workforce? Absolutely. But is it also right to take those same dollars and put them toward corporate social responsibility or limiting our carbon footprint on the world? Yes, that is. Is it also right to return value to shareholders? Yes, it is, right? It's these competitions between right versus right issues that are the tough ones. And some of that does have to do with ethical decision making, but even more so, it's about who do I want to be and who do we want to be as a firm? What kind of culture do we want to have? What kind of, sense of character do we want to have as a bigger organization? And, to Carolyn's point, scholars call this the judgment action gap, where when we make a judgment, the correlation between making an ethical decision or judgment and actually behaving in line with that judgment has been found to be only about 0.20. Now, what that means is the vast majority of the time we make decisions and say things like, oh, they shouldn't do that, or somebody ought to do something about that, but us taking the stand to say, I should do something about that and then act in line with our beliefs, that's where the real magic happens. And that's where I think, particularly in business schools, we need to throw more of the tough, hairy problems at our students and help them to think through these right versus right and wrong versus wrong. Sometimes we have to create harm, and the question is to whom, and how are we going to manage that decision making? Wrestling with those tough ones and then tie it all back to our character again of what we want to be is so critically important. And I think, and this is one thing I think we really do well in the School of Business here at Wake Forest. I also think these decisions have to be integrated with the functional aspects of business. So here in Wake Forest, we have the Center for Leadership and Character that's actually called within the school a proponent, responsible for integrating ethics and leadership across the entire curriculum. And that's where the magic happens. The marketing classes should be teaching marketing and, oh, by the way, immersing it to a certain extent in these aspects of ethics and character and value and what is it to be an effective leader. Same thing in finance, same thing in strategy and all the other functional areas, so that as people are thinking through business problems, they're integrating character and ethics into those business problems as just part of the decision criteria, along with the business viability of a decision and all of that. But I just think we spend too much time, not only in business schools, but in business, focusing on what I would call moral obligation versus moral aspiration. If you look at almost any code of conduct for almost any business, it's about what you should do and not do, very behaviorally. A lot less about who we should be. And instead of worrying about, hey, let's make sure that our employees stay above the moral floor, they don't do anything wrong and they do the minimum of what needs to be done, The question is, how can we try to get a culture where people want to aspire toward the moral ceiling? That idea of moral aspiration. So you're guided on principles and beliefs and ideals, and not a set of behaviors that one feels that I need to do and not do, the oughts and the ought nots. And anyways, I just think that having that broader, richer conversation is really critical. And the last thing that I would just say is, going back to my earlier point, that we internalize character and values and beliefs because we find them functional. I can't just give somebody a list of values and say, hey, these are the corporate values, so you need to live by them. I need to be able to sit that person down and say, why do we have these values? And why these and not others? What was the inclusion exclusion criteria? Why did we say these are the most important things that we need to be, know, and do in this organization? And then make sure that we operationalize them. I think Larry used that term earlier. You know, put them in operation. So we say something like respect. Okay, what does that even mean? And what does that look like? If I'm on the plant floor in Picatinny on the assembly line, what does respect mean to me? What does it look like in behaviors and actions and decisions? And if we don't operationalize and drill that down and apply these vague words, we're really doing a disservice for our organizations. So with that, I'll yield.
Thank you. And that feels like it's a great setup to some comments from Larry.
Well, I would just say, as a first principle, leaders really need to decide whether this conversation is optional or fundamental to the sort of culture that they're trying to create, the team they want with them in pursuit of the mission. And I know plenty of leaders who are quite eloquent on the topic, but to borrow from Carolyn, who probably aren't all that sincere, right? Either in their boardroom or on that shop floor that Sean just referenced. But the leaders that I've come to really respect over time really have made these sorts of behaviors fundamental to the way they lead and the type of companies that they're trying to build. But to just expand a little bit on what it means to operationalize, at least at GE today, we try to talk about our leadership behaviors at every turn. Hopefully our leaders are modeling those behaviors in every possible situation. And we take great pains to both reward and frankly punish behaviors that are either in sync or at odds with those leadership behaviors. I mentioned earlier, we recast our leadership behaviors, a short list of 3 a year ago: humility, transparency, and focus. I won't bore you with all the details, but that's been a rallying cry for a senior team and frankly a board at a time in the company's history where some might say, why are you even bothering? There's so much else that you need to tend to. Why would you talk about values, leadership behaviors? Why would you talk about culture? And I can even see it in the eyes of investors. There are investors whose eyes just glaze over when we get into that part of the GE story today. But then there's other investors who really understand that this is part of a long-term transformation of the company. You talk about modeling this behavior. I remember very vividly early on, I was with one of our businesses. We had just won a big contract, cause for celebration. I quite innocently asked, well, what happens next? Not knowing that I had walked into a situation where the customer gave us a big contract award, but our first meeting with them couldn't have gone worse. And that was probably more our doing than theirs. The person who got the question 3 levels down from me just was clearly mortified that this was on the table. I could look around the room and there were others more senior than him that I think were similarly uncomfortable. To his credit, he told me exactly what happened, that it had not been a good meeting. It was one of those moments where you are tested, right? Do you overreact, or take that as an opportunity to do a little bit of problem solving, to do a little bit of teaching? We took the latter course. You could see everyone's blood pressure come down. It was a wonderful moment to try to model the behavior that we want to have be part of our culture going forward. And we've also taken great pains in our performance evaluation framework, not only to recognize what people do, but how they do it. Now, some of that is rooted in process, but frankly, the how is also very much rooted in the values and the behaviors that, again, we want to reward, or frankly, we need to punish. So that's the way we're going about it. but it never happens quickly, right? This is the ultimate long march relative to organizational or cultural change in my book, but also the most important one at the end of the day.
Thank you. Definitely. I think a theme running through a lot of the comments today is just the importance of thinking of this as the long game and as a process that never really completes and that we're all continually working toward. I do have one eye on the clock here, and so I think we have time for one last question. You can believe it, we're almost already at time. I knew this would fly by. The last thing I would put to the panel is I'd like to invite us all to just look into the crystal ball a little bit. And kind of as you look into the future of the profession of business, what ethical issues do you see as being particularly prominent in, let's say, the next 5 years? So we can take that in a number of directions. Sean, would you like to lead us off?
Sure. Yeah, I think Larry's probably the most equipped to speak to that, but I'll give it my best college try to kick off. I think, Taya talked a lot about short-termism as being a major issue, and I would echo that. I think particularly in today's information technology environment and the transparency that businesses have to operate under, people are much more able to quickly see what you're doing, scrutinize what you're doing, and agree or disagree with what you're doing. And we've got activist investors, and there's just a lot more activity happening now that are making sometimes you wonder who's wagging the dog, right? Or the tail here. And the short-termism, of course, then leads to a lot of possible dysfunctional behaviors, not only the misplacement of capital investments and things for the long-term success of the organization, but also it lends itself toward expediency and maybe some unethical behavior to meet nearer term objectives. But I think a much larger and bigger issue is with a lot of the social movements going on now, the roles and responsibilities of business. And what are those? Because every institution is now being challenged. And the question becomes, what is the purpose of business? And if we don't get down and have those deeper conversations about that, it's very difficult for leaders to then understand, how should I lead a business? I first need to know, what should it be? And one of the issues that I get very concerned about is an issue of fear. You ask what ethical issues, I would say fear of many businesses to truly be authentic and say what they really believe in and what they don't believe in. And that's one of the issues. If we ask ourselves, what is culture? All scholars of culture will define it something like it's the shared truths and assumptions of a collective and their formulation of shared values and beliefs. So by definition, culture has that word shared in it. And so when we say we have a culture, whether it's a national culture or a culture in a business or whatever, what we're saying is there are a set of things that we share that we believe in. And as soon as we say that, we're drawing a circle. And there are things inside that circle, and there are things outside that circle. And it's a very difficult conversation today to have in today's world, because if anybody finds themselves or their group or their ideals or their beliefs outside the circle, well, obviously then the person who draw the circle comes under great scrutiny and public, we all know what's going on. So the question becomes, a business leader has to decide, are we going to have a culture? It's a very fundamental question. And if we are, we have to be willing to stand up and draw a circle and say, these are the things we believe in around here, and that there are things outside the circle. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges now, is that definition. And then, this conversation around, again, what is the roles of business? What's the roles of capitalism? And how do we approach that in a way that is going to sustain not only business, but society into the future? So I'll kind of stop there and yield the floor to others.
Big questions that we've introduced with 3 minutes to go. Larry, I wonder if you have a thought or two you'd like to add.
Yeah, I would just build on that. At GE, we talk about the 3 Ds in terms of the mega trends over the next generation or two that will shape both the opportunities and the challenges facing our business: digitalization, decarbonization, and certainly the decoupling, not just US-China, but really the way the world is likely to fragment in different ways over time. In each of those three spheres, there are going to be important trade-offs that Sean referenced earlier, let alone cross currents amongst those three areas. And that's not just a GE dynamic in my view, that's literally going to come ashore in every business, and how we go about decision-making with respect to priorities, with respect to resource allocation, I think will just be chock full of challenge and intrigue for business leaders going forward. And the types of topics we talked about today, I think are going to be central to navigating those trends successfully.
Thank you, Larry. Carolyn, do you have a couple of thoughts to add?
Yeah, I see two major trends, but before I say that, I think Larry mentioned something I want to echo. When you talk about how do students really learn, I think students learn from looking at our behavior. They also learn from being the recipient of how we treat them. I think Sharon Parks did a very good job to say, you know, the university is a very important mentoring environment to young people. It's the first time they engage in environment on their own as adults. So I just want to say that, because I think a lot of times universities focus on courses and centers and research and speakers, but the university needs to focus on itself as really sort of the first teacher of how values are put into action in the way they engage as students. I'll be quick on my two big trends. I think that ESG, where companies always said they're doing something, now has a different level of seriousness and integration into the business strategy. If you are not engaged on a social level in terms of the, not just responsibility, but to have the legitimacy and the right of way, a different social contract that people are looking for, you know, in the management of jobs, for example, and benefits and well-being of employees, and of course, the environment. I think there's a very big trend. Is no longer a marginal undertaking. It has to be an integrative undertaking. The second point is the call for accountability is at a completely different level. And so particularly the E part of it, there are all these new metrics, new frameworks, using AI and the amount of data and AI and so on to start really calling firms, companies accountability. And internally, the relationship between the company and the employees is also, because of social media and you know, the access to information. So this whole area of transparency, accountability in particular, is at a different level. So much more is expected of companies in terms of how it internalize the ES, and the G part has already taken place. So greater responsibility and much greater monitoring.
Thank you. Mary.
Well, so I kind of want to build on what Carolyn was just saying. I mean, Sean and Larry and Carolyn have all identified huge trends that are important, right? I mean, equity and inclusion, digitalization, sustainability, climate change, and all of these kinds of issues. But I want to take a step behind those and to say that I think what we're really facing is what I'm calling crisis of truth. You know, where in order to address any of those issues, short-termism even, you know, when you talk about how you value or measure the value of the firm, I think behind all of those is a sense that right now we don't have a common language, agreed upon metrics, agreed upon priorities, and even just agreed upon facts, you know, and I put that in quotes, to be able to talk about and resolve any of those issues that we've been naming. And so when I look at the responsibility of business, of everyone, but including business, because they're such a powerful actor in the face of that crisis of transparency, I mean, that crisis of truth, is transparency. And when I say transparency, I mean it in terms of about the data we're using, about the sources of the data we're using, about the metrics we're using, about our own motivations for using and choosing that data and those metrics, about what we see as the limitations of that data and those sources, so that we're not all going to come to the same conclusions about what the right thing to do is, but we do need to have some sort of beginning of a conversation about what to believe in order to begin to make those decisions. And so I would say transparency in that broadest sense.
And it kind of gets back to Sean's point about who do we want to be, and that then shapes the definitions that I think you're calling for, Mary. Well, I think at this point, we are going to move toward a wrap up. This has been a very, very rich hour of conversation, as I knew it would be. I would really like to thank our distinguished panelists, Larry, Mary, Sean, Carolyn. Thank you for sharing your perspectives, your rich experience with us today. You've given all of us a lot to think about as we each strive in our own way to be leaders of character. And we're just grateful for your insights. I'd also like to thank our audience participants for choosing to spend part of a sunny, I hope, in your neck of the woods Saturday afternoon with us. And I hope that you have found in this last hour some ideas, some thoughts, some key moments maybe that sort of give you a new way of thinking or a way of expanding your thinking around the critical importance of leading with character. So with that, I will thank you all, and I believe Ed will take it from here. Thank you, Ed.
Well, that was a rich hour indeed. Thanks to you, Professor Reem, and to our panelists for a wonderful conversation on the role of character in business. And thanks to you all for joining us wherever in the world you are joining us from. We very much hope you'll come to our next session, which is on character and law, and will begin at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The link is now available in the chat. And please note, it's a different link to the link we are currently on. So do take and copy down that link. We very much hope you will join us there. Thank you very much.